fog rolled thick through the wynds of Edinburgh's Old Town, curling around the blackened stones like something sentient, something waiting. It was past 2 in the morning when the watchman heard it, a sound that was not quite a scream, not quite a sob, but something worse. Something that suggested a throat half closed, a voice draining into silence. He lifted his lantern and the flame shuddered in the damp air. The narrow alley ahead disappeared into shadow, and somewhere within that shadow something moved. By dawn, they would find her. A young woman, no more than 20, her body arranged with terrible care against the cold stone of a tenement wall. Her hands had been folded across her chest. Her eyes were open. There were no signs of struggle, no torn fabric, no scattered belongings, only the bruises at her throat dark as plums, and the strange symbol carved into the wood of the door beside her. 3 lines crossing, ancient and deliberate like a signature left in mockery. It was the 3rd such death in as many months. The city had begun to whisper. The kirk ministers spoke of judgment. The magistrates posted notices. The night watchmen doubled their rounds, though none could say what they were watching for. And in the taverns and the closes, in the tenements where candles burned low and mothers pulled their children close, a name began to take shape in the darkness. The Midnight Killer, a shadow that walked among them, a presence that chose its victims with a logic no living soul could fathom. The city held its breath, and the killer, whoever he was, whatever he was, walked on through the fog. Chapter 1. The City of Smoke and Stone. Good evening, and welcome to the Bedside Historian. The night around you is quiet now, perhaps still, perhaps dark. Wherever you are listening from, whether beneath blankets in a distant city, or alone in the small hours, know that you are safe here. The past cannot reach forward, it can only whisper. But listen closely. Tell me, if you would, where are you listening from tonight? What hour marks your clock? And if this voice brings you comfort in the darkness, if these old stories ease you towards sleep, consider subscribing. There are many more nights ahead, and many more shadows to explore. Now, let us drift backward through the centuries, through the gaslight and the fog, to a city built on bones and rock, where history pressed down like stone upon stone, and where, in the autumn of 1820, something began to move through the winds that no one could name. Edinburgh stood black against the Scottish sky. It was a city that had grown upward rather than outward, constrained by the volcanic rock upon which it perched and by the ancient walls that had once kept invaders at bay. The old town rose in layers, tenements climbing 6, 7, 8 stories high, their walls blackened by centuries of coal smoke, their windows narrow as arrow slits. Between them ran the wynds and closes, those steep, narrow passages that twisted down from the Royal Mile toward the valley below, dark as throats, slick with rainwater and waste. The wealthy had begun their migration northward across the valley to the new town, where Georgian terraces stood clean and rational in their ordered rows. But the old town remained, ancient, crowded, alive with the press of humanity. 30,000 souls lived packed into those towering tenements. Families shared single rooms. Strangers slept in shifts in the same beds. The air was thick with the smell of tallow, yan smoke, unwashed wool, and the ever-present reek of the midden heaps that festered in the courts below. By day, the city roared. Fishwives cried their wares at the Tron. Advocates in their wigs and gowns hurried between Parliament House and the law courts. Sedan chairs navigated the crowds on the high street. The castle loomed above it all, grey and permanent, a reminder that Scotland's heart had always been a fortress. By night, the city transformed. The taverns and oyster cellars remained open, their windows glowing amber in the darkness, but the winds fell silent. Constables walked their beats with lanterns, their footsteps echoing off stone. The night soil men made their rounds, emptying the waste of the day into carts bound for the fields beyond the city. And in the tenements, families huddled close to their fires, doors barred, as the autumn wind howled down from Arthur's Seat and rattled the old glass in its frames. Edinburgh in 1820 was a city caught between ages. The Enlightenment had burned bright here a generation before. David Hume and Adam Smith had walked these very streets, had argued philosophy in the taverns, had helped birth the modern world. The university still drew students from across Europe, The Royal Society met regularly. Physicians practiced the new sciences. Rationality, it seemed, had triumphed. And yet, the old beliefs had not entirely vanished. In the Canongate, women still made the sign against evil when passing certain doorways. In the grass market, where the gallows had stood for centuries, people quickened their pace after dark and spoke of the restless dead. The Kirk ministers preached a faith that was stern and absolute, a faith that saw the hand of God in every misfortune and the hand of the devil in every sin. Superstition and science lived side by side, sometimes in the same mind, sometimes in open conflict. The city's relationship with death was intimate and constant. Bodies were buried in the kirkyards that dotted the old town, Greyfriars, Canongate, Old Calton, but the ground was full and had been full for generations. Graves were reused, bones surfaced after heavy rains, and in the decades past the resurrectionists had plied their grim trade, digging up the freshly buried to sell to the anatomist at Surgeons' Hall. Burke and Hare had committed their murders less than a decade before, smothering their victims to supply the dissection tables. The trial had scandalized the nation. Burke had hanged in 1829, his body publicly dissected as a final humiliation. Edinburgh remembered. The city carried its dead with it always, layered beneath the living like sediment. In the autumn of 1820, the season turned early. September brought cold rains that swept in from the Firth of Forth, turning the cobblestones slick and the winds into rushing streams. The fog rolled in thick most evenings, rising from the low ground of the Nor Loch, long since drained but still damp, still breeding mist, and climbing upward to swallow the old town whole. By October, frost touched the stones at dawn. By November, the first snow would dust the castle ramparts. It was a season of transition, of darkness arriving earlier each day, of fires banked high and doors shut tight. A season when the city turned inward, when neighbours became strangers in the gloom, when every footstep on the stair might be friend or threat. The watch had been established to keep order, but they were few and the city was vast. Each constable walked a beat that might span a dozen wynds, checking doors, challenging late wanderers, breaking up fights in the taverns. They carried lanterns and staffs, and the authority of the magistrates behind them. But they were mortal men, and they grew tired, and there were hours in every night when whole districts lay unwatched. The women of Edinburgh knew this better than anyone. The seamstresses who worked until their eyes ached by candlelight, the laundresses who rose before dawn to haul water from the wells, the servants who hurried through the dark to light fires in the new town houses, the prostitutes who worked the tavern districts and the Cowgate. All of them navigated the night with a practiced caution, moving quickly, staying to the broader streets when possible, travelling in pairs when they could. But sometimes there was no choice. Sometimes the errand was urgent, or the hour was late, or the way home led through narrow places, and Edinburgh's winds were many, and they twisted upon themselves like a maze, and in the fog even familiar routes could become strange. The city had seen violence before, of course. Murders were not unknown. Drunken brawls turned fatal. Domestic disputes ended in blood. Bodies were found in the closes, throats cut or skulls broken, and the magistrates investigated and sometimes hanged the guilty and sometimes did not. Life in the old town was hard and cheap, and death arrived in many guises. But what began in August of 1820 was different. It began with a pattern. It began with a precision that spoke not of rage or desperation or greed, but of something colder, something deliberate, something that seemed to select its victims according to a logic that no one could yet perceive. It began with Margaret Dowie, found in the grey light before dawn in Advocates' Close, her body arranged with terrible care, her eyes open to the stones above, and a symbol carved into the wood beside her that no one in Edinburgh could identify. The watchman who discovered her had served for 12 years. He had seen bodies before. He had seen the aftermath of knife fights and beatings. He had seen what poverty and drink could do to the human form. But when he lifted his lantern and saw Margaret Dowie lying there in the narrow close, hands folded across her chest as if she'd been laid out for burial, he felt something new. He felt the cold certainty that this was not an ending, but a beginning. He felt that something had entered the city that did not belong to any category of crime or violence that he understood. He called for help. Others came. By full light, a crowd had gathered at the mouth of the close, held back by the constables murmuring and craning to see. The body was removed to the mortuary. The magistrates were informed. A physician was summoned to examine the remains, and in the taverns that evening, and in the tenements where neighbours gathered on the stairs to share what news they had, the story spread. A young woman, no signs of struggle, bruises at the throat, and a mark carved into the door. 3 lines crossing, deliberate and strange. Some said it was an accident, a tragic misfortune. Some said it was a lover's quarrel. Some said the mark meant nothing, that it had been there before, that people were seeing patterns where none existed. But in the deep places of the old town, in the rooms where grandmothers still remembered the old stories, where the Bible sat beside charms against the evil eye, there were whispers of something else. Whispers that Edinburgh's long memory had been disturbed. Whispers that something from the city's buried past had risen. Whispers that the killing had only just begun. The fog rolled in that night as it always did, and the watchmen walked their routes, and the city slept uneasily beneath its blanket of smoke and stone. And somewhere in the darkness, in one of the 1,000 winds that threaded through Edinburgh's heart, someone walked alone, invisible, patient, already choosing the next name on a list that only they could see. Chapter 2. The First Silence. Margaret Dowie had been 23 years old. She had worked as a seamstress in a shop on the South Bridge, one of the establishments that catered to the middling sort, merchants' wives, lawyers' daughters, women who wanted their gowns made well, but could not afford the fashionable dressmakers of the new town. Margaret had steady hands and good eyes, and she could finish a hem with stitches so small they were nearly invisible. Her employer, a widow named Mrs. Blackwood, said she had been reliable, always on time, never complained, kept to herself. She had lodged in a tenement on the Cowgate, sharing 2 rooms with her younger sister and an elderly aunt. The rent was paid, the rooms were clean, there was no trouble with drink, no trouble with men, no debts outstanding that anyone could discover. She attended services at Tron Kirk on Sundays. She had been saving her wages, her sister said, hoping eventually to open a small shop of her own. On the night of August the 7th, Margaret had worked late. A customer had needed alterations completed urgently for a wedding, and Mrs. Blackwood had asked her to stay. The shop closed at 9. Margaret had left shortly after, carrying her small work basket, wearing a dark wool shawl against the evening chill. The walk from the South Bridge to the Cowgate was not far, 15 minutes at most, but it required passing through several wynds, and one of those was Advocates' Close, a steep, narrow passage that descended from the high street down toward the valley below. It was a route Margaret had walked 100 times before. She never reached home. The watchman who found her made his discovery at 4:30 in the morning. His name was Robert Kelso, and he had been walking the high street beat checking doors when he decided to descend into Advocates' Close to investigate a sound, something that might have been a cat, or might have been a shutter banging loose in the wind. He carried a lantern fueled with whale oil, and its light threw long shadows against the tenement walls as he descended. The close was perhaps 4 feet wide at its broadest point, the buildings pressing in on either side, their upper stories overhanging so that they nearly touched. The air was damp and cold. Kelso's footsteps echoed off the stone. He found her 30 feet down from the high street entrance. She lay on her back, centered carefully in the narrow passage. Her arms had been positioned across her chest, right hand over left, as if she were a carved effigy on a tomb. Her shawl had been smoothed down. Her skirts had been arranged to cover her legs modestly. Her eyes were open, staring upward at the slice of sky visible between the buildings. Kelso raised the lantern higher. There was no blood visible, no torn clothing. Her work basket sat beside her, its contents undisturbed. Her face was pale but peaceful, showing none of the contortion that usually accompanied violent death. But when Kelso knelt closer, he saw the bruising. Dark marks encircled her throat, finger-width, like a necklace of shadows. Someone had strangled her. Someone strong enough to cut off breath and blood until consciousness fled and the heart stopped. And they had done it without causing her to cry out, without any apparent struggle, in a close where sound carried, and where a scream would have echoed up to the high street like a bell. Kelso stood. His hands were shaking. He raised his lantern again and played the light across the walls on either side. That was when he saw the mark. It had been carved into the wooden door of one of the tenement entrances, about 5 feet above the ground. 3 straight lines, each perhaps 6 inches long, crossing at angles to form a pattern that resembled a star, or perhaps a rune from some alphabet Kelso did not recognize. The cuts were fresh, pale wood showing through the weathered surface of the door. They had been made with a blade, carefully and deliberately, each line straight and clean. Kelso had served as a watchman for 12 years. He had seen bodies pulled from the water of Leith. He had investigated murders and suicides and accidental deaths. But he had never seen anything like this. The positioning of the body, the strange calm of the scene, the symbol carved as if in signature. He climbed back up to the high street and found the nearest constable. By dawn, word had spread through the watch, and from the watch to the magistrates, and from the magistrates to the physicians and kirk ministers who formed the city's unofficial council in matters of death and morality. The body was removed to the mortuary beneath the Tron Kirk, where the dead were kept before burial or examination. Dr. James Moncrief, a surgeon who served as one of the city's examining physicians, performed an inspection later that morning. He was a man in his 50s, trained at the university, well versed in anatomy and the new forensic sciences that were beginning to emerge from the Enlightenment's shadow. He had dissected bodies, he had testified at trials, he had seen what violence could do to human flesh. His report was brief and precise. The deceased was a well-nourished female of approximately 23 years. No signs of disease or prior injury, no evidence of sexual assault. No defensive wounds on the hands or arms. Cause of death, asphyxiation by strangulation. The bruising on the neck indicated manual strangulation, likely from the front, with considerable force applied. Death would have occurred within 2 to 4 minutes. Time of death estimated between 9:30 and midnight the previous evening. Dr. Moncrief noted one additional detail that troubled him. The positioning of the body suggested it had been arranged post-mortem. Rigor mortis had begun to set in by the time of discovery, fixing Margaret Dowie's arms in their crossed position. Whoever had killed her had taken the time afterward to lay her out carefully, to smooth her clothing, to fold her hands. This was not the work of someone fleeing a scene in panic. This was deliberate. This was someone who had stayed with the body, alone in the dark, arranging it like a sculptor arranging clay. The magistrates reviewed the report and interviewed Margaret's family and employer. They could find no motive, no jealous suitor, no outstanding debts, no enemies that anyone could name. Margaret Dowie had been, by all accounts, an ordinary young woman living an ordinary life in Edinburgh's crowded heart. The carved symbol was copied and shown to various scholars and antiquarians in the city. No one could identify it with certainty. Some thought it resembled old Pictish marks, the kind found on standing stones in the Highlands. Others suggested it might be alchemical, or Masonic, or simply the idle scratching of someone with a knife and time. The door belonged to a tenement that housed 6 families. None of them had seen or heard anything unusual that night. The magistrates issued a brief statement. A young woman had died under suspicious circumstances. Anyone with information should come forward. Extra watchmen would be assigned to the area. The investigation would continue. But in truth, there was little to investigate. No witnesses, no clear motive, no evidence beyond the body itself and the strange mark beside it. Within a week, the general opinion among the city's authorities was that Margaret Dowie had likely been killed by someone she knew. A lover, perhaps, or an acquaintance who had arranged to meet her in the close and had then strangled her in a fit of passion or madness. The positioning of the body was unusual, certainly, but murderers were not always rational. The mark on the door might be unrelated, or it might be the killer's way of commemorating the act, or it might mean nothing at all. The case remained open, but dormant. The watchmen continued their rounds. Life in Edinburgh went on as it always did, loud and crowded and indifferent to individual tragedy. Margaret Dowie was buried in Greyfriars Kirkyard on a cold afternoon, attended by her sister and aunt and a handful of women from the seamstress shop. Mrs. Blackwood paid for the stone. The grave was shallow, as all graves in Edinburgh were, the ground too full of previous occupants to dig deep. In the tenements, mothers warned their daughters to be careful walking home at night. In the taverns, men speculated briefly about who might have done it, then turned to other topics. In the magistrates' offices, the file was set aside, awaiting new evidence that would likely never come. But in the room where Margaret Dowie had lived, Her sister sat by the window and watched the street below as the evenings grew longer and the fog rolled in thicker. She thought of Margaret walking home that night, through streets she knew by heart, carrying her work basket, perhaps thinking of the shop she would one day own. She thought of the moment when Margaret had turned into Advocate's Close, descending into that narrow darkness. She thought of what had been waiting there, and she could not stop wondering why. Why Margaret? Why that place? Why the careful arrangement afterward, as if the killing itself were not enough, as if the body had to be displayed like something in a museum, preserved for whoever would find it. The sister's name was Catherine, and she would live another 40 years. She would marry and have children and grow old in Edinburgh, and she would never learn what happened to her sister in Advocate's Close. She would never know who carved that symbol, or what it meant, or whether it was a message or merely madness given form. She would only know that Margaret had walked into darkness and never returned, and that somewhere in the city someone had watched her go and had followed, and had killed her with a patience that suggested this was not impulse but intention. That somewhere in Edinburgh someone was capable of this, and that the streets were not as safe as anyone had believed. Chapter 3. The pattern emerges. September came with heavy rains. The streets ran with water that pooled in the courts and turned the wynds into cascades. The gutters overflowed. The midden heaps became swamps of filth that spread their stench through entire districts. People hurried between doorways with cloaks pulled tight, boots sinking into mud, cursing the weather and the city's ancient drainage. The magistrates of Edinburgh met weekly in their chambers off Parliament Square to discuss the city's business: maintenance of the watch, collection of revenues, disputes between merchants, enforcement of Sunday observance. On the 14th of September, they reviewed the status of several ongoing investigations, including the death of Margaret Dowie. There was nothing new to report. No witnesses had come forward. No suspects had emerged. The case was, for all practical purposes, at a standstill. The magistrates moved on to other matters. 3 days later, on the 17th of September, a body was found in the Cowgate. The Cowgate ran east to west through the valley south of the Royal Mile, a broad street lined with tenements and warehouses and taverns that catered to the working poor. It had once been a fashionable address centuries before, but those days were long past. Now it was a district of labourers and tradesmen, of smoke-blackened buildings and perpetual noise. By day it roared with commerce, by night it belonged to the drunks and the desperate. The body was discovered at dawn by a carter making his way to the grass market. She lay in the entrance to one of the narrow closes that branched off the Cowgate, positioned in the same careful manner as Margaret Dowie had been. On her back, arms crossed, clothing arranged, eyes open to the grey sky above. Her name was Helen Murray. She was 28 years old. She had worked as a laundress, taking in washing from several of the Newtown households and scrubbing it clean in the communal washhouse near the Norloch. She had lived alone in a single room on the 3rd floor of a Cowgate tenement. She had no family in Edinburgh. Her parents were dead. She had never married. The bruising on her throat was identical to what Dr. Moncrief had observed on Margaret Dowie. Manual strangulation from the front, considerable force, death within minutes, no signs of struggle, no defensive wounds, no evidence of sexual assault. And carved into the wall beside her, at shoulder height, was the same symbol. 3 lines crossing, fresh cuts in the old stone, deliberate and clean. Dr. Moncrief examined the body and wrote his report with a hand that was not quite steady. He had seen violence throughout his career, but there was something about the methodical nature of these killings that disturbed him in ways he could not fully articulate. The killer was not frenzied. The killer was not desperate. The killer was patient and careful, and apparently invisible, moving through Edinburgh's crowded streets without leaving any trace beyond the bodies themselves. The magistrates reconvened in emergency session. Word had already begun to spread through the city. 2 women, both strangled, both found arranged in the same manner, both marked with the same strange symbol. Coincidence was no longer a plausible explanation. Edinburgh had a murderer, and the murderer was still at large. The Lord Provost, who chaired the magistrates' meetings, was a merchant named William Trotter. He was a practical man, concerned primarily with maintaining order and commerce. Murder was bad for both. He wanted the killer found quickly and quietly, before panic could spread and before the newspapers could make the situation worse. The city guard was instructed to increase patrols in the Old Town. Additional watchmen were hired on temporary contracts. Notices were posted offering a reward of £50 for information leading to an arrest. The Kirk ministers were asked to mention the matter in their sermons, encouraging vigilance and caution. But there was a problem, and everyone in the magistrates' chamber knew it, though no one wanted to say it aloud. Edinburgh was a city of 30,000 people, living in a space barely a mile square. The Old Town was a labyrinth of wynds and closes and courts, hundreds of them, thousands of doorways, endless opportunities for someone to move unseen. The watch could not be everywhere. The constables were few and the darkness was vast. And the killer had demonstrated a discipline that suggested they would not be caught through ordinary means. They chose their victims carefully. They killed efficiently. They took the time to arrange the bodies and mark the locations. They did all of this without leaving any physical evidence, without being seen, without making mistakes. Dr. Moncrief attended the magistrates' meeting and was asked for his professional opinion. Was there anything in the bodies themselves that might help identify the killer? He chose his words carefully. The bruising patterns suggested the killer had large hands and considerable strength. The strangulation had been accomplished face-to-face, which required both power and control. Most strangulation deaths involved attacks from behind. The lack of defensive wounds suggested the victims had been taken by surprise, or perhaps subdued quickly before they could react. The arrangement of the bodies post-mortem suggested someone with time and confidence, someone who was not afraid of being discovered, someone who felt safe enough in these locations to stay with the bodies, to position them carefully, to carve the symbols, and the symbols themselves. Dr. Moncrief admitted he had consulted with colleagues at the university, with antiquarians and scholars. No one could identify them definitively. They might be religious, they might be ritualistic, they might be the product of a deranged mind seeking to impose some kind of order or meaning on the acts, or they might be a message. One of the magistrates, an advocate named Thomas Ross, asked the obvious question. If it was a message, who was the intended recipient? No one had an answer. The meeting concluded with instructions to continue the investigation and to report any new developments immediately. The magistrates filed out into the rain, and Dr. Moncrief walked slowly back to his rooms on George Street, thinking about patterns and meanings, and the way certain minds could twist inward upon themselves until violence became the only language they knew. In the tenements of the Cowgate, Helen Murray's few possessions were gathered by the landlord and sold to pay her back rent. She had no one to mourn her except the other laundresses who had worked alongside her at the washhouse, and they could spare only an hour to see her buried in an unmarked grave in the kirkyard at Canongate. The newspapers printed brief notices. Another suspicious death. The authorities investigating. Citizens advised to exercise caution. But the word that spread through the city was not caution. The word was fear. In the taverns and the markets, people began to speak of the killings as if they were connected to something larger than one individual's madness. Some said it was divine judgment, that Edinburgh's sins had drawn God's wrath. Some said it was the work of Fenians or radicals, though no political motive was apparent. Some said it was a curse, that the symbols were marks of old magic, that someone had opened a door to something that should have remained closed. The women of Edinburgh began to change their habits. They travelled in groups after dark. They avoided the narrower wynds. They carried hatpins and small knives tucked into their sleeves. Mothers kept their daughters close. Employers adjusted working hours so that no woman had to walk home alone late at night. And still the fog rolled in each evening thick and cold, turning the city into a place of shadows and echoes where anything might be waiting, just beyond the reach of the nearest lamp. Robert Kelso, the watchman who had found Margaret Dowie, walked his beat with a new awareness of how little he could actually see. The lantern he carried created a small sphere of light, perhaps 10 feet in diameter, and beyond that was only darkness. Someone could be standing 20 feet away and be completely invisible. Someone could be following him through the winds and he would never know. He thought about the killer, about how they chose their victims, about how they moved through the city without being seen. And he wondered if the killer was watching him now, somewhere in the fog, patient and invisible, waiting for the next opportunity. On the 28th of September, another notice appeared in the Caledonian Mercury, Edinburgh's oldest newspaper. The editor, a man named Alexander Brown, had decided that silence was more dangerous than information. He published a detailed account of both murders, including descriptions of the victims, the locations, and the carved symbols. He concluded with a question that everyone in Edinburgh was thinking, but few had dared to voice. How many more will die before this monster is caught? The answer, though no one yet knew it, was 3. Chapter 4. The Watch Gathers. The October moon rose full and cold over Edinburgh Castle. From the ramparts, a sentry could see the entire city spread below. The massed tenements of the old town, the orderly crescents of the new, the black ribbon of the water of Leith winding through the valley, and beyond, the dark expanse of the Firth of Forth reflecting silver in the moonlight. It was a view that had changed little in centuries. The same stones, the same streets, the same narrow places where history accumulated like sediment. But something was different now. The city felt smaller, the darkness felt deeper. And in the taverns and tenements, in the drawing rooms of the new town and the courts of the Cowgate, people spoke of the killings in hushed tones, as if speaking too loudly might draw attention, might somehow make them the next target. The magistrates had moved beyond emergency meetings to a state of permanent vigilance. The watch had been doubled. Every able-bodied man who could carry a lantern and walk a beat had been pressed into service. They walked in pairs now, covering the wynds and closes in overlapping patterns, checking doors, challenging anyone abroad after midnight. But Edinburgh had hundreds of wynds, and 2 watchmen could not be everywhere. The Lord Provost had authorised the formation of citizen watch committees, groups of merchants and tradesmen who volunteered to patrol their own districts after hours. They carried clubs and lanterns and a sense of civic duty that felt increasingly inadequate against an enemy no one could identify or predict. In the new town, where gaslighting had been installed along some of the principal streets, residents felt relatively safe. The broad avenues and open squares made concealment difficult. The houses had proper locks and servants who slept within earshot. The killer, whoever they were, seemed to operate in the older, darker parts of the city, where the winds twisted and the shadows were thick. But the old town could not simply be abandoned. 30,000 people lived there. They worked there. They could not afford to move to the new town's expensive terraces. They could only adapt and hope and lock their doors at night. The Kirk ministers preached with new fervour. At Tronkirk and St Giles and Canongate, the sermons turned dark and urgent. The Reverend Thomas Chalmers, one of Edinburgh's most prominent divines, delivered a sermon on the 5th of October that would be remembered for decades afterward. He stood in the high pulpit of St Giles, his voice echoing through the ancient nave, and he spoke of sin and judgment. He spoke of Edinburgh's prosperity and pride, of how the city had turned away from God's law, of how rationalism and science had replaced faith, of how the taverns and brothels and theatres had corrupted the moral fabric of the people. And now, he said, God had sent a reminder, a scourge, an angel of death walking among them, marking the guilty, striking down those who had strayed from righteousness. It was not a popular sermon. Many in the congregation shifted uncomfortably. Many felt it was too harsh, too quick to assign blame to the victims, but others nodded. Others felt the comfort of explanation, even if that explanation was terrifying. Better to believe this was divine judgment than to believe it was random. Better to believe there was meaning than to accept chaos. The physicians and natural philosophers took a different view. Dr. Moncrieff met with several colleagues at the Royal College of Physicians to discuss the killings from a scientific perspective. They reviewed his reports. They examined the pattern of the murders. They debated theories. One physician suggested the killer might be suffering from a form of moral insanity, a condition in which the reasoning faculties remained intact, but the moral sense was damaged or absent. Such individuals, he argued, could appear perfectly normal in society, while harbouring violent impulses they could not control. Another suggested the killings might be motivated by sexual pathology, even though no sexual assault had occurred. Perhaps the act of killing itself provided the gratification. Perhaps the arrangement of the bodies was a form of ritualized expression of desires the killer could not otherwise fulfill. Dr. Moncrieff listened to all of this and felt increasingly certain that they were dealing with something beyond the categories they had available. The killings were too deliberate, too carefully executed, too marked by the strange symbols that suggested a meaning or purpose no one had yet deciphered. He had begun to study the symbols himself, sketching them in his notebook, comparing them to various alphabets and iconographies. They resembled some of the marks found on Pictish stones in the Highlands. Angular, geometric, stark. But they were not exact matches, and even if they were Pictish, what did that mean? The Picts had vanished 1,000 years ago, absorbed into the Scottish kingdom, their language lost, their beliefs forgotten, unless someone was trying to resurrect them. Unless someone had discovered something in the old stones, in the old stories, and was attempting to recreate it in the modern world. Dr. Moncrieff did not share this theory with anyone. It sounded too much like superstition, too much like the kind of thinking the Enlightenment had been supposed to banish. But late at night, alone in his study with the fire burning low, he could not shake the feeling that the symbols were not random, that they were part of a language, and that whoever carved them was trying to communicate something. The question was, with whom? In the taverns and oyster cellars, different theories circulated. Some said the killer was a foreigner, a sailor from the port at Leith perhaps, someone passing through who would vanish as mysteriously as they had arrived. Others said it was a resurrectionist, someone familiar with bodies and death, someone who had learned to kill cleanly and efficiently from years of handling corpses. Still others whispered that it was someone respectable, someone above suspicion, a merchant or lawyer or physician who led a double life. The reward money had brought forward a flood of useless information. Dozens of people claimed to have seen suspicious figures in the wynds. Every stranger became suspect. Every man walking alone after dark was challenged by the watch. Several innocent citizens were briefly detained and questioned before being released. But nothing solid emerged. No credible witnesses. No physical evidence. No motive that connected the victims beyond their gender and their vulnerability. Margaret Dowie had been a seamstress. Helen Murray had been a laundress. They had not known each other. They lived in different districts. They attended different kirks. They had no friends or acquaintances in common that anyone could discover. The only connection was the manner of their deaths and the symbols left beside them. On the 15th of October, the magistrates met with the professors of the university to solicit their expertise. The gathering included philosophers, physicians, and scholars of antiquity. They assembled in one of the university's lecture halls, a wood-panelled room that smelled of old books and pipe smoke. The discussion ranged widely. Professor James Gregory, a mathematician and physician, suggested the symbols might be a code, a way for the killer to record information about the victims or the circumstances. If they could decipher the code, they might predict where or when the next attack would occur. Professor John Leslie, a natural philosopher, argued that the symbols were more likely meaningless, the product of a disordered mind seeking to impose structure on chaotic impulses. Madmen often created elaborate systems, he noted, systems that appeared meaningful to them but were incomprehensible to others. A young lecturer in classics named David Irving proposed that the symbols might be derived from ancient Greek or Roman mystery religions, cults that had practiced ritual murders and marked their victims with sigils. Perhaps someone had studied these practices and was attempting to recreate them. The discussion continued for 3 hours and reached no consensus. The scholars departed with nothing resolved except the certainty that Edinburgh faced something unprecedented. That night, the watch walked their routes with renewed determination. Robert Kelso descended into Advocates' Close as he did every night, his lantern held high, his staff ready. He paused at the spot where he had found Margaret Dowie, and looked at the door where the symbol had been carved. Someone had tried to scrub it away, but the cuts were too deep. The lines were still visible, pale against the weathered wood. Kelso stood there for a long moment, listening to the silence of the close, feeling the weight of the buildings pressing in on either side. Somewhere in the city the killer was waiting. Somewhere the next victim was going about their life, unaware that they had been chosen. And somewhere, carved into stone or wood or perhaps only into the killer's mind, another symbol was waiting to be made, another mark in a pattern that only one person understood. Kelso climbed back up to the high street and continued his rounds. The moon rose higher, the fog rolled in, and Edinburgh held its breath and waited for the darkness to claim another soul. Chapter 5. The Third Victim. October brought the first hard frost. The morning of the 23rd dawned clear and cold, the sky pale as parchment, the cobblestones rimed with ice that glittered in the weak sunlight. Smoke rose from 10,000 chimneys, hanging in the still air like a pall. The bells of St. Giles struck 7, and the city stirred to life with the creak of shutters opening and the clatter of carts on stone. In Fleshmarket Close, a narrow wynd that descended steeply from the high street toward the market street below, a baker's apprentice named Thomas Reed was making his morning delivery. He carried a basket of bread on his shoulder, navigating the icy steps with practiced care, calling out greetings to the few early risers he encountered. The close was aptly named. Butchers had once plied their trade here, and the smell of old blood still seemed to linger in the stones. At the bottom of the close, where it met the broader street, Thomas stopped. A woman lay against the wall, positioned as if she had simply sat down to rest. Her back was against the stone, her legs were extended straight in front of her, her hands were folded in her lap, one over the other, fingers interlaced. Her head was tilted slightly to the right, her eyes open, staring at nothing. Thomas set down his basket. His breath came in white clouds. He stepped closer, already knowing what he would find, already feeling the cold certainty spreading through his chest. The bruises on her throat were clearly visible even in the grey morning light, dark as ink. Finger-width impressions pressed deep into the pale skin, and carved into the wall beside her, at eye level, the symbol. 3 lines crossing, fresh cuts in the old stone, the same deliberate pattern that had appeared beside Margaret Dowie and Helen Murray. Thomas ran. He ran up the close, slipping on the ice, catching himself against the walls, his breath tearing in his throat. He emerged onto the high street and found a constable and gasped out what he had seen. The constable followed him back down, and together they stood over the body while the morning light strengthened and the city began to wake around them. Her name was Annie Forsyth. She was 19 years old, the daughter of a baker who operated a shop on the Canongate. She had helped her father with the baking, rising before dawn to knead dough and tend the ovens. She had been walking home the previous evening after delivering bread to a customer near the castle. The route should have taken 20 minutes. She never arrived. Her father had searched for her through the night, walking the streets with a lantern, calling her name, checking with neighbours and shopkeepers. By dawn he had reported her missing to the watch, and now she was found, arranged like a doll against the wall of Fleshmarket Close. Her life ended with the same brutal efficiency that had claimed the others. Dr. Moncrief was summoned before breakfast. He arrived in the close still wearing his morning coat, carrying his medical bag, moving with the deliberate calm that came from years of confronting death in its many forms. But when he knelt beside Annie Forsyth and saw how young she was, saw the childlike smallness of her hands folded in her lap, something broke in his professional composure. He performed his examination with mechanical precision, manual strangulation. Death occurred between 8 and 11 the previous evening. No signs of struggle, no defensive wounds, the same pattern as before, exact in every particular. He stood and looked at the carved symbol on the wall. He had brought his notebook with him, and he added this location to his growing map of the killings. Margaret Dowie in Advocate's Close, Helen Murray in the Cowgate. Now Annie Forsyth in Fleshmarket Close. 3 points on a map, 3 women dead, 3 symbols carved in stone and wood. Dr. Moncrief traced the lines with his finger, not quite touching the stone. 3 straight cuts, each about 6 inches long, meeting at angles that created a shape like a star with 3 points, or like 3 roads converging, or like 3 scratches made by something with claws. He closed his notebook and walked slowly back up the close toward the high street, his mind turning over possibilities and finding no purchase. Behind him, the constables were organising the removal of the body. Around him, the city was waking to the news that the killer had struck again. By midday, Edinburgh was in turmoil. The newspapers printed special editions. The Caledonian Mercury ran a front-page story with the headline, "The Midnight Terror Strikes Again." The Scotsman published an editorial demanding action from the magistrates and suggesting that the city's ancient watch system was inadequate to protect citizens from a murderer who operated with such impunity. In the taverns, men spoke of nothing else. Some called for vigilante justice, for groups of citizens to patrol the wynds with weapons and deal with the killer themselves if the authorities could not. Others spoke fearfully of supernatural causes, of demons or vengeful spirits that could not be caught by mortal hands. The women of Edinburgh withdrew further into protective routines. Schools kept children late rather than send them home in the gathering darkness. Employers closed their shops early. The streets that had once been busy until 10 or 11 at night now emptied by 8. The city was imposing its own curfew, born not of law, but of fear. Annie Forsyth's father, Malcolm, sat in his shop on the Canongate with the ovens cold and the bread unsold. Neighbours came to offer condolences, but he could not hear them. He could only think of Annie walking home the previous evening, through streets she had known her entire life, carrying the empty basket, perhaps thinking of the wedding she had been hoping to have in the spring to a young carpenter who worked near the castle. He thought of her turning into Fleshmarket Close, descending those steep steps, moving into the shadows where the buildings pressed close. He thought of what had been waiting for her there, and he could not understand why. Annie had harmed no one. She had lived a simple life, dutiful and kind, devoted to her family and her faith. What had she done to deserve this? What had any of them done? The Kirk ministers offered answers, but they were cold comfort. The Reverend Chalmers preached again at St. Giles, his voice rising to fill the vast nave, speaking of how God's ways were mysterious, how suffering was a test of faith, how the righteous must endure trials to prove their devotion. But sitting in the pews, listening to these words, many felt only a growing sense of abandonment. If God was testing them, the test seemed cruel. If this was divine judgment, it seemed arbitrary. Margaret Dowie, Helen Murray, Annie Forsyth. These were not the great sinners of Edinburgh. They were ordinary women trying to live ordinary lives, and now they were dead. Arranged like exhibits in a museum of horror, marked with symbols no one could read. Dr. Moncrieff attended the magistrate's emergency session on the evening of October 23rd. The chamber was crowded with city officials, constables, and prominent citizens who had demanded to be present. The Lord Provost called for order and asked for reports from the watch captains. The reports were uniform in their inadequacy. No witnesses, no suspects, no evidence. The watch had been doubled, then tripled. Patrols covered every major wind. But the killer remained invisible. One of the magistrates, a man named Andrew Stewart, stood and spoke what many were thinking. Perhaps the killer was not working alone. Perhaps there were multiple killers, coordinating their attacks. That would explain how they could operate with such impunity, how they could be in different parts of the city, how they could evade the watch so completely. Dr. Moncrieff rose and respectfully disagreed. The consistency of the method suggested a single hand. The symbols were identical in their execution, showing the same technique, the same blade, the same deliberate care. These were not the work of a gang or conspiracy. This was one individual, operating with extraordinary discipline and knowledge of the city, and that, he said, was what troubled him most. The killer knew Edinburgh intimately. They knew which winds were least patrolled, which times were safest for their purpose, how to move through the city without attracting notice. This suggested someone local, someone who had lived here long enough to understand the city's rhythms and patterns. The killer might be anyone. They might be sitting in this very chamber, watching and listening, learning what the authorities knew and adapting accordingly. The room fell silent at this suggestion. Men looked at one another with new suspicion. The idea that the killer could be someone respectable, someone trusted, someone who moved freely through Edinburgh's society. It was almost worse than believing in demons. The Lord Provost broke the silence by announcing that the reward for information would be increased to £100, a substantial sum that might loosen tongues. He also announced that the university had agreed to provide consulting services, that scholars would examine the symbols and attempt to determine their origin and meaning. But even as he spoke, William Trotter knew these were gestures, actions taken to show the public that something was being done. In truth, they were no closer to catching the killer than they had been in August. The murderer operated in darkness, struck without warning, and vanished without trace. Against such an enemy, rewards and consultations meant nothing. The meeting adjourned with instructions to maintain vigilance and to report any developments immediately. The men filed out into the cold October night, pulling their coats tight, glancing over their shoulders, feeling the weight of failure and fear. Dr. Moncrieff walked home slowly through the new town, where the gas lamps glowed warm and the streets were broad and safe. He thought about patterns and symbols and the human capacity for violence. He thought about how civilization was a thin veneer, how beneath it lay older instincts, older drives that reason could not always contain. He thought about the 3 women lying in the mortuary, their lives cut short, their deaths serving some purpose that only the killer understood. And he wondered if there would be a 4th, a 5th, a 6th. How many would die before this ended? Or would it ever end? Would the killer simply stop one day, as mysteriously as they had begun, leaving behind only questions and unmarked graves? In his study, Dr. Moncrief opened his notebook to a fresh page and drew the symbol again. 3 lines crossing. He had drawn it dozens of times now, trying to understand it, trying to see it the way the killer saw it. What did it mean? Was it a signature? A declaration? A piece of some larger pattern not yet complete? He sat until the fire burned low and the candle guttered, but no answers came. Only the symbol, stark and angular on the white page, staring back at him like something alive, something waiting. Outside his window, Edinburgh slept uneasily beneath a sky full of stars that looked down with the same cold indifference they had shown for 10,000 years. The castle stood dark on its rock, the tenements huddled close in their wynds, and somewhere in that maze of stone and shadow, someone moved through the night with blood on their hands and purpose in their heart. Annie Forsyth was buried on the 26th of October in the Canongate Kirkyard. The funeral was attended by hundreds. Her father stood beside the grave and wept openly. The minister spoke of eternal rest and heavenly peace, but his words seemed to dissolve in the cold air like breath. As the coffin was lowered into the ground, many in the crowd looked around nervously as if expecting the killer to be present, watching from among the headstones. It was a common belief that murderers often attended their victims' funerals, drawn by some perverse need to witness the grief they had caused. But if the killer was there, they gave no sign. They were invisible, as always. A ghost moving through the city, a shadow with hands that killed and carved and vanished back into the darkness from which they came. The grave was filled. The crowd dispersed. The kirkyard returned to its ancient silence, and in the days that followed, as October faded toward November, Edinburgh waited with held breath for the killer to strike again, knowing it was not a question of if, but when. Chapter 6. Theories in the Dark. The University of Edinburgh occupied a collection of buildings scattered through the southern edge of the old town, their facades blackened by centuries of coal smoke, their courtyards worn smooth by generations of students. Within these walls, some of the greatest minds of the Enlightenment had taught and studied. David Hume had walked these halls. Adam Smith had lectured here. The medical school was renowned throughout Europe. The natural philosophy department had produced discoveries that changed how humanity understood the world. And now, in late October of 1820, these great minds were being asked to explain a series of murders that seemed to defy rational understanding. Professor David Irving stood before a seminar of colleagues in one of the smaller lecture rooms, holding a piece of paper on which he had carefully copied the symbol that appeared beside each victim. He was a man in his early 40s, a classicist who specialized in ancient languages and mystery religions. He had spent the past week researching everything he could find about ritual markings, cultic practices, and symbolic systems. He began his presentation with a disclaimer. What he was about to suggest was speculative. The evidence was fragmentary. But given the unusual nature of the crime, speculation might be all they had. The symbol, he proposed, bore resemblance to marks found in several ancient contexts. The Picts of northern Scotland had carved similar angular patterns into standing stones, though the meanings of these carvings had been lost when their civilization vanished. The ancient Greeks had used geometric symbols in certain mystery cults, particularly those associated with Hecate, goddess of the night and crossroads. And in medieval grimoires, books of magic and demonology, there existed sigils that combined straight lines in similar patterns. What united all these contexts, Professor Irving noted, was their association with boundaries and transitions. The Pictish stones often marked territorial borders or sacred sites. Hecate presided over liminal spaces, doorways, crossroads, thresholds between worlds. The medieval sigils were used to summon or bind entities, to create connections between the mortal realm and others. Perhaps, he suggested, the killer viewed these murders as some form of ritual. Perhaps the symbols were meant to mark sacred or significant locations. Perhaps the killer believed they were accomplishing something beyond simple murder, opening doorways, making offerings, enacting some pattern that had meaning in a system of belief no one else shared. The room was silent when he finished. Professor James Gregory, the mathematician, was the first to respond. He thanked Irving for his research, but suggested that they were in danger of imposing meaning where none existed. The human mind was exceptionally good at finding patterns, even in random data. Perhaps the symbol was meaningless, a product of madness rather than method. Professor John Leslie agreed. He had studied cases of moral insanity throughout his career, and one common feature was the creation of elaborate systems that appeared meaningful to the sufferer, but were incomprehensible to others. The killer might believe the symbols had power or significance, but that did not mean they actually did. A physician named Robert Knox, who taught anatomy, offered a different perspective. He had been studying the physical evidence from the murders, the bruising patterns, the positioning of the bodies, the lack of defensive wounds. What struck him was the extraordinary control the killer demonstrated. Strangulation required strength, yes, but it also required technique. The killer knew exactly how much pressure to apply, and where, to achieve death quickly and quietly. This suggested, Dr. Knox argued, that the killer had anatomical knowledge. They understood the human body's vulnerabilities. They knew how to kill efficiently. This was not the work of a common criminal or a passion-driven murderer. This was someone educated, someone with medical or surgical training. Dr. Moncrief, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. He agreed with Dr. Knox that the killer demonstrated unusual competence, but he was not convinced this necessarily indicated medical training. Butchers understood anatomy, soldiers understood killing, even some criminals developed expertise through experience. What troubled him more was the consistency of the ritual, and he used that word deliberately, despite the objections raised. Whether or not the symbols had any objective meaning, they clearly had meaning to the killer. They were not random scratches. They were carefully executed, identical across all three murders. The killer invested time and effort in creating them, which suggested they served some purpose in the killer's internal logic. And if they could understand that logic, perhaps they could predict where or when the killer might strike next. Professor Irving returned to the lectern and unrolled a map of Edinburgh's Old Town. He had marked the 3 murder locations with red ink: Advocates' Close, the Cowgate, Flesh Market Close. He had also drawn the symbol beside each mark. Was there a geographic pattern? The locations were all in the Old Town, all in narrow wynds, all relatively close to the high street. But beyond that, no obvious pattern emerged. The locations did not form a geometric shape. They did not align with any obvious landmarks or boundaries, unless, Professor Irving suggested, the pattern was not yet complete. If the killer intended to create some larger design, 3 points might not be enough to reveal it. 4 or 5 might make the pattern clear. The implication hung in the air like smoke. They were discussing future murders as if they were inevitable, as if the only question was when and where, not if. Dr. Moncrief felt a deep weariness settle over him. They were scholars and scientists, trained to observe and analyze and draw conclusions from evidence. But the evidence they had was so sparse, so ambiguous, that they were reduced to speculation and guesswork. They were no closer to catching the killer than the constables walking their beats through the wynds. The meeting concluded with an agreement to continue researching the symbols and to share any new findings immediately. The professors filed out, leaving Dr. Bray and Moncrief alone in the lecture room with the map still spread on the table. He studied the 3 red marks, 3 women dead, 3 symbols carved, 3 points in a pattern he could not yet see. He thought about what Professor Irving had said about boundaries and transitions, about thresholds between worlds. What if the killer was trying to create such a threshold? What if the murders were not ends in themselves, but means to some other purpose? What if the killer believed that by arranging bodies in certain ways, by carving certain symbols, by enacting these careful rituals, they could accomplish something? It was a disturbing thought. It suggested a mind operating according to rules that had nothing to do with human law or morality, a mind that saw the victims not as people, but as components in some larger work. Dr. Balk. Moncrief rolled up the map and walked out into the October evening. The university courtyard was empty, the windows of the buildings glowing with lamplight. Students hurried past, heads down against the cold wind, thinking of exams and lectures and the ordinary concerns of young lives. They did not yet know that Annie Forsyth had been found that morning. The news was spreading, but slowly, moving through the city like a sickness. By tomorrow, everyone would know. By tomorrow, the fear would deepen. And the day after that, and the day after that, Edinburgh would continue to wait for the next killing, powerless to prevent it, unable even to understand it. Meanwhile, in the closes and winds of the old town, theories multiplied like shadows. Some said the killer was a resurrection man, one of the grave robbers who had once supplied the medical schools with bodies. Burke and Hare had been caught and punished, but perhaps others had continued the trade, and perhaps one of them had developed a taste for fresher sources. Some said it was a foreign sailor, someone who came ashore at Leith when ships were in port and hunted through the old town before vanishing back to sea. This would explain why no one recognized the killer, why they seemed to appear and disappear like a ghost. Some said it was a woman, that only a woman could approach these victims without raising alarm, that the lack of defensive wounds suggested the victims trusted their killer until the moment hands closed around their throats. Some said it was a member of the aristocracy, someone wealthy enough to move freely without suspicion, educated enough to create the elaborate symbols, powerful enough to evade investigation. Dark rumours circulated about certain lords and their peculiar interests, about secret societies that met in hidden chambers beneath Edinburgh's streets. And some, particularly in the older generations who remembered Scotland before the Enlightenment, who had grown up with tales of brownies and kelpies and the second sight, said it was not human at all. They spoke of old things that walked the earth, things that had been here long before Edinburgh was built, things that occasionally stirred and hungered and took what they wanted. These whispers were dismissed by the educated classes as superstition, as the kind of ignorance that modern science had been meant to dispel. But in the tenements, where people still hung rowan branches above their doors and drew chalk marks on their thresholds, where the old stories were passed down through generations like heirlooms, the whispers persisted. And on certain nights, when the fog rolled in especially thick and the wind howled down from the castle rock, even some of the educated classes felt a shiver of doubt. What if the rational world they had built was not as complete as they believed? What if there were spaces where the old darkness still lived, where things they did not understand could move and act and kill? Dr. Moncrief did not believe in ghosts or demons. He had dissected too many bodies, seen too much of the mechanical reality of flesh and bone to credit supernatural explanations. Whatever was killing these women was human. Human hands left those bruises. A human blade carved those symbols, but human did not mean understandable. Human did not mean sane. And somewhere in the vast category of human behavior lay actions that seemed to transcend normal comprehension, that operated according to logic so alien they might as well be supernatural. He returned to his rooms on George Street and poured himself a whiskey. He sat by the fire and opened his notebook to the page where he had been sketching theories. He had written dozens of possibilities, then crossed most of them out. Nothing fit. Nothing explained the totality of what they were seeing. The one thing he kept returning to was the symbols. They were the only deliberate communication the killer offered. Everything else about the murders could be functional. The strangulation was efficient. The positioning of the bodies might simply reflect the killer's compulsions. But the symbols required effort. They took time. They were meant to convey something. Dr. Moncrief copied the symbol once more, larger this time, taking care to render each line exactly as it appeared in his sketches from the crime scenes. 3 straight lines meeting at angles, simple, stark, angular. He stared at it until the fire burned low and his eyes grew tired. And as he stared, he had the unsettling feeling that the symbol was staring back, that it was not merely a mark but a kind of eye, something that saw and judged and waited. He closed the notebook and went to bed, but sleep came slowly. Outside his window, Edinburgh settled into its troubled rest. The watch walked their routes. The constables checked doors. The citizens dreamed uneasily behind locked shutters, and somewhere in the darkness the killer dreamed too, if killers dreamed, planning perhaps, or remembering, or preparing for what came next. The pattern was not yet complete. The symbols had more to say, and Edinburgh, whether it knew it or not, was waiting for the next word to be carved into its ancient stones. Chapter 7. The Fourth Shadow. November came cold and relentless. The trees on the slopes of Arthur's Seat stood bare and black against grey skies. The wind cut through the wynds like a blade, carrying with it the smell of coal smoke and coming snow. The days grew shorter. By 4 in the afternoon the light was failing. By 5 darkness had claimed the city, and the lanterns of the watch became small islands of illumination in a sea of shadow. 3 weeks passed after Annie Forsyth's death. 3 weeks of heightened vigilance, of patrols and curfews and fear. The magistrates maintained their emergency sessions. The watch remained doubled. Citizens stayed indoors after dark. The city held its breath and waited. And slowly, gradually, a dangerous hope began to emerge. Perhaps it was over. Perhaps the killer had fled Edinburgh or died or simply stopped. 3 murders was a terrible toll, but it was finite. Life could return to some approximation of normal. The shops could reopen their evening hours. Women could walk home from work without terror. The city could exhale. Dr. Moncrieff did not share this hope. He had studied the murders too carefully, seen the deliberation in every detail. This was not someone who would stop at 3. The pattern felt incomplete. The symbols suggested a sequence not yet finished. He said as much in a meeting with the Lord Provost on the 10th of November, but his warnings fell on ears that wanted to hear good news. William Trotter was a merchant first and an administrator second. He understood costs and benefits. The doubled watch was expensive. The disruption to commerce was expensive. 3 weeks without another murder seemed like evidence that the crisis had passed. Dr. Moncrieff left the meeting frustrated. He walked through the new town's orderly streets, past the elegant facades and the gas lamps that glowed in the gathering dusk, and he felt a growing certainty that Edinburgh's respite was temporary. On the night of November 15th, his certainty was confirmed. The victim was found near Holyrood Palace at the eastern end of the Royal Mile, where the city began to give way to open ground. The location was called Horse Wynd, a narrow passage that descended from the Cannon Gate down toward the ruins of Holyrood Abbey. It was a quiet area, less crowded than the districts further west, bordered on one side by the palace grounds and on the other by the King's Park. She was discovered at dawn by one of the palace groundskeepers making his morning rounds. He saw what he thought was a bundle of cloth against the wynd's wall and went to investigate. Then he saw the hands folded across the chest, the open eyes, the bruising at the throat, and carved into the stone of the wall behind her, the symbol, 3 lines crossing, deep cuts in the ancient masonry, precise and deliberate as always. Her name was Catherine Reed. She was 31 years old, a widow who worked as a cook in one of the Newtown households. She had been walking home to her lodgings on the Cannon Gate after finishing her day's work. The walk from the Newtown across to the eastern end of the Royal Mile was substantial, more than a mile, but she made it every day. She was known to be reliable and cautious. She carried a small knife in her pocket for protection. It had not saved her. Dr. Moncrieff arrived at Horsewynd within an hour of the body's discovery. He had been expecting this, dreading this, and now that it had happened, he felt a kind of grim vindication mixed with profound despair. He performed his examination with mechanical efficiency. The findings were identical to the previous murders. Manual strangulation, no defensive wounds, no signs of struggle or sexual assault. Death occurring sometime between 8 and midnight the previous evening. The arrangement of the body was the same. The symbol was the same. Only the location had changed, extending the killer's range eastward, closer to the palace, into an area that should have been safer. The magistrates convened in emergency session within hours. The room was tense. Lord Provost Trotter looked as though he had not slept, his face drawn and pale. The hope that had been building for 3 weeks had collapsed in a single morning, replaced by renewed fear and the bitter knowledge that they had failed to protect their citizens. Dr. Moncrieff presented his findings and then spread his map on the table. 4 red marks now. Advocates Close, the Cowgate, Flesh Market Close, Horse Wynd. He had drawn lines connecting them, trying to find a pattern, but none was apparent. The locations seemed scattered, following no obvious geographic logic. Unless, he suggested, they were not meant to follow a geographic pattern. Perhaps the pattern was temporal or symbolic, or based on criteria they could not yet perceive. One of the magistrates, Andrew Stewart, slammed his hand on the table in frustration. They had doubled the watch. They had increased the reward. They had done everything they could think of. and still the killer moved through the city as if invisible, selecting victims at will, leaving their carefully arranged bodies as some kind of macabre message. What were they supposed to do? Post a constable at every wynd? That was impossible. Edinburgh had hundreds of wynds. The watch was already stretched beyond its limits. They could not prevent every murder in a city of 30,000 people. Dr. Moncrief understood the frustration, but had no solutions to offer. The killer had demonstrated extraordinary skill at evading detection. They struck only when the opportunity was perfect, when the victim was alone and vulnerable, when no witnesses were nearby. They operated with patience and discipline that suggested they could wait as long as necessary for the right moment. The only hope was that the killer would make a mistake, that they would be seen or leave evidence, or choose a victim who managed to escape. But so far, the killer had made no mistakes. The meeting concluded with instructions to maintain the doubled watch and to increase the reward to £200. But everyone in the chamber knew these were empty gestures. They were fighting an enemy they could not see, could not predict, and could not understand. The newspapers published the news that afternoon. The Midnight Terror claims fourth victim. The Caledonian Mercury printed Dr. Moncrief's description of the symbol and asked readers to come forward if they recognized it from any context: ancient, modern, scholarly, or occult. Dozens of responses arrived within days, but none were credible. People saw what they wanted to see. Some claimed the symbol was Masonic, others said it was alchemical, others insisted it was demonic, a sign of witchcraft or Satan worship. Professor Irving examined all the suggestions and found none convincing. The symbol remained enigmatic, resistant to interpretation, its meaning known only to the person who carved it. Catherine Reed was buried in the Canongate kirkyard on a grey November afternoon with sleet falling. Her employer attended, as did several of the other servants from the Newtown household where she'd worked. They spoke of her as quiet and competent, a woman who kept to herself but did her work well. She had no family in Edinburgh. Her husband had died years before. She had lived alone and worked alone and died alone in a narrow wynd with no one to hear her final moments. After the funeral, Dr. Moncrief walked along the Royal Mile toward the castle, thinking about patterns and victims and the nature of evil. 4 women dead now: Margaret Dowie, Helen Murray, Annie Forsyth, Catherine Reed, ages ranging from 19 to 31, occupations different: seamstress, laundress, baker's daughter, cook. No obvious connections between them. What had they shared besides their gender and their fate? What had made them targets? Dr. Moncrief turned into Advocates' Close and descended to the spot where Margaret Dowie had been found. The symbol was still visible on the door, though someone had hung a cloth over it, as if covering it might somehow undo what had happened here. He stood in the narrow space, feeling the buildings press close on either side, and tried to imagine what Margaret had experienced. Had she known her attacker? Had she seen them approach? Had there been a moment of recognition, or had the attack come from behind, from the darkness? The close was silent except for the sound of water dripping somewhere above. The air was cold and damp. This was a place where sunlight rarely reached, where the stones held centuries of accumulated shadow. Dr. Sust. Moncrief climbed back up to the high street and continued walking. He descended into Fleshmarket Close, into the Cowgate, retracing the geography of murder, trying to understand what the killer saw in these places. They were all narrow, all dark, all relatively isolated despite being in the heart of the city. They were liminal spaces, thresholds between the high street above and the lower districts below, passages that people moved through quickly, not places where anyone lingered. Boundaries, transitions, just as Professor Irving had suggested. But boundaries between what? Transitions to where? Dr. Moncrief had no answers. He returned home as dusk was falling, the gas lamps igniting one by one along George Street, and he sat in his study with the fire burning low and tried to think like a killer. If you wanted to send a message, how would you do it? You would choose your medium carefully. You would ensure the message was clear and consistent. You would repeat it until someone understood. The killer was repeating the message. 4 times now, the same symbol, the same arrangement. But if it was a message, who was the intended audience? The city? The authorities? Some specific person? Or perhaps the message was not meant for anyone in Edinburgh at all. Perhaps it was meant for something else, something that existed outside normal human communication. Perhaps the killer believed they were speaking to gods or spirits, or forces that required blood and symbols to hear. Dr. Moncrief shook his head. He was falling into speculation again, into theories that could not be tested or proven. He needed evidence. He needed something concrete. But the killer left nothing concrete, only bodies and symbols and questions that multiplied like reflections in opposing mirrors. In the tenements of the old town, mothers pulled their daughters close and told them they could not go out after dark, not for any reason. In the taverns, men drank more heavily and argued about who the killer might be, and sometimes these arguments turned violent, as if punching another drunk could somehow expunge the fear they all felt. In the Newtown drawing rooms, ladies discussed the murders in hushed tones, expressing shock and horror while secretly thrilling at the darkness that had invaded their orderly world. Some found the danger exciting in an abstract way. They had never been in any real danger themselves. Their streets were lit and guarded. Their houses were secure. The murders were terrible. Certainly, but they happened elsewhere, to other people. Dr. Moncrief knew this insulation would not last. The killer had already moved eastward, closer to the new town. Catherine Reed had worked in a Newtown household. The boundary between safe and unsafe was eroding. Eventually, the danger would cross that boundary entirely, and then the comfortable residents of the Georgian terraces would understand what the old town had known for months, that nowhere was truly safe, that the killer could strike anywhere. That civilization was a thinner protection than anyone wanted to believe. November deepened. The frost came nightly now, turning the cobblestones treacherous, and the winds into channels of ice. The first snow fell on the 23rd, dusting the city white before melting into grey slush. The watch walked their beats with numb fingers and boots that soaked through. The constables grew tired and irritable. Vigilance was exhausting, especially when it seemed futile, and still the killer waited, invisible and patient. Somewhere in the frozen city, perhaps planning the next strike, perhaps simply biding time, letting the fear ripen before acting again. Dr. Moncrief marked the days on his calendar, counting the time between murders. August to September, 40 days. September to October, 36 days. October to November, 23 days. The intervals were shortening. The killer was accelerating. And if that pattern held, the next murder would come soon, very soon. He wrote a letter to the Lord Provost warning of this, urging renewed vigilance, suggesting specific winds that fit the pattern of previous attacks. But he knew his warnings would accomplish little. The watch could not be everywhere. The killer would strike when and where they chose. All Edinburgh could do was wait and hope and pray that somehow the pattern would break. The killer would err, and the nightmare would end before more women died in the cold embrace of the city's ancient stones. Chapter 8. The city holds its breath. Winter settled over Edinburgh like a shroud. December arrived with iron cold and skies the colour of tarnished silver. The days grew so short that it seemed darkness reigned almost perpetually, with only a brief interlude of grey light between dawn and dusk. Snow fell intermittently, accumulating in the winds and courts, turning black within hours from the coal smoke that hung perpetually over the old town. The castle disappeared into low clouds. The Firth of Forth froze at its edges, ice forming in crystalline sheets along the shore. The city contracted into itself. Fires burned constantly in every hearth that could afford fuel. Windows were sealed with rags against the drafts. Families huddled together for warmth, sharing beds, sharing breath, existing in a state of suspended animation as they waited for spring and for deliverance from the terror that walked among them. 4 weeks passed after Catherine Reed's death. 4 weeks during which every evening brought fresh dread. Every morning brought relief that no new body had been found. The watch maintained their patrols, though frostbite claimed several fingers and toes. The constables walked routes they could navigate blindfolded, their lanterns creating small spheres of yellow light in the overwhelming darkness. Dr. Moncrief continued his research, though he felt increasingly like a man trying to read a language that had no alphabet. He had collected every scrap of information about the murders, had interviewed anyone who might have seen something, had consulted with scholars and physicians, and even in desperation, with an elderly woman who claimed knowledge of the old Highland ways. She had examined his sketches of the symbols in her dim cottage near the Water of Leith, her fingers trembling with age as she traced the lines. She'd spoken in Gaelic first, then translated for him. The marks were old, she said. Older than the Kirk, older than the Romans, older than memory. They were boundary marks, she claimed. Gates, ways of calling things that should not be called. Dr. Moncrieff had thanked her and left, unsure whether she was genuinely knowledgeable or simply another voice adding to the chorus of speculation. But her words stayed with him. Gates, boundaries, thresholds. He thought again of what Professor Irving had said months before, the Pictish stones marking territorial limits, Hecate presiding over crossroads, the medieval grimoires with their sigils for summoning. What if the killer genuinely believed they were opening something, creating passages between worlds? The murders would then be sacrifices, the symbols would be keys, and the careful arrangement of the bodies would be ritual necessity. It was a disturbing thought, not because Dr. Moncrieff believed in such things, but because someone else clearly did. Someone with the will and ability to kill repeatedly in service of that belief. In the taverns and closes, the mood had shifted from fear to something darker. Anger, frustration, a sense that the authorities had failed, that the magistrates were incompetent, that the watch was useless. Vigilante groups formed and dissolved. Men armed themselves with clubs and knives and walked the wynds looking for suspicious characters. Several innocent strangers were beaten. A peddler from Ireland was nearly killed before constables intervened. The city was turning on itself, suspicion poisoning the social bonds that had once held communities together. Neighbours watched neighbours. Landlords questioned tenants. Employers scrutinized servants. Everyone was potentially guilty because no one knew what guilt looked like. Dr. Moncrieff attended a meeting at the university on the 8th of December, a gathering of physicians and natural philosophers attempting once more to make sense of the pattern. Professor Gregory had been analysing the intervals between murders, looking for mathematical relationships. Professor Irving had been studying ancient ritual practices, searching for parallels. Dr. Knox had been examining the physical evidence, looking for any detail previously overlooked. They shared their findings in a seminar room that smelled of coal smoke and old books. Outside the windows, snow fell steadily, muffling the sounds of the city. Professor Gregory presented his analysis first. The intervals between murders were decreasing, as Dr. Moncrieff had noted. 40 days, 36 days, 23 days. If the pattern continued, the next murder would occur approximately 16 days after Catherine Reed's death, which meant it was already overdue by several days, unless Professor Gregory suggested the pattern was not linear but exponential. Or perhaps it was seasonal, affected by the shortening days and the difficulties of operating in winter weather. Or perhaps the killer had been forced to stop for reasons unrelated to their desires. Injury, illness, having left Edinburgh temporarily. Too many variables, too many unknowns. The mathematics could describe what had happened but could not predict what would happen next. Professor Irving spoke next about his research into ancient rituals. He had found several examples of sacrificial practices that involved the positioning of bodies and the carving of symbols. The Phoenicians had conducted child sacrifices at sacred sites marked with stelae bearing geometric designs. Certain Gnostic sects had practiced ritual murders as part of their cosmology. The ancient Celts had killed in honour of their gods, sometimes arranging the victims in specific postures. But none of these practices matched exactly what was occurring in Edinburgh. The symbols were not quite right. The methods were different, and most importantly, those ancient practices had been communal, public, carried out by priests or entire communities. What was happening in Edinburgh was solitary, secretive, the work of a single individual operating alone. Dr. Knox reported that he had nothing new to add. The physical evidence remained consistent across all 4 murders. The killer was strong, knowledgeable about human anatomy, patient, and extraordinarily disciplined. They left no trace of themselves beyond their work. No fibres, no footprints that could be distinguished from the general traffic, no witnesses who could provide useful descriptions. The killer was, for all practical purposes, invisible. The meeting concluded with the same sense of futility that had characterized all previous discussions. They were intelligent men, trained in observation and analysis, and they were helpless against an enemy who operated according to rules they could not decipher. Dr. Moncrief walked back through the snow-covered streets, his breath white in the frigid air. The city looked almost beautiful under its blanket of white. The harsh edges softened, the blackened stone momentarily pure. But he knew it was an illusion. Beneath the snow, Edinburgh remained what it had always been, ancient, crowded, full of narrow places where darkness gathered and violence could occur unseen. He thought about the 4 women who had died. He had never met any of them in life, but he felt he knew them now, had studied their bodies and their histories until they haunted his thoughts. Margaret with her careful stitches, Helen with her strong hands reddened from washing, Annie with her dreams of marriage, Catherine with her quiet competence. They deserved better than to be remembered only as victims, only as entries in a series of unsolved murders. They deserved to have their lives honoured, their deaths avenged, their killer caught and punished. But Dr. Moncrief was beginning to doubt whether justice would ever come. In the magistrate's chambers, similar doubts were taking root. The Lord Provost had received letters from prominent citizens demanding action, threatening to take matters into their own hands if the authorities could not protect them. Several wealthy merchants had hired private guards. Some families had sent their daughters away from Edinburgh entirely, to relatives in the countryside where they would be safe from the midnight terror, as the newspapers had taken to calling the killer. The phrase had caught on with the public. The midnight terror. It suggested something almost supernatural, something beyond mere human evil. And in the cold depths of December, with darkness dominating each day and the killer still at large, many in Edinburgh were willing to believe that what they faced was indeed something more than mortal. The Kirk ministers preached to increasingly large congregations. Fear had driven people back to religion, seeking comfort and explanation in scripture and tradition. The Reverend Chalmers continued his fire and brimstone sermons at St. Giles, warning that Edinburgh's sins had brought this plague upon them, that only repentance and prayer could lift the curse. But other ministers took a gentler approach. They spoke of God's mysterious ways, of the need for faith in dark times, of the importance of community and mutual protection. They organised prayer vigils and encouraged their congregations to look after one another, to ensure that no one walked alone, that no one was forgotten or neglected. These efforts helped, at least marginally. The sense of community that had been fraying under the weight of suspicion began to knit itself back together. Neighbours checked on neighbours. Shopkeepers walked their employees home. The city was learning to adapt, to create new patterns of behaviour that might offer some protection against the threat they could not eliminate. Christmas approached, though the usual celebrations were muted. There were no large gatherings, no late-night parties, no groups of carolers walking the streets after dark. Families celebrated quietly in their own homes, grateful simply to be alive and together. Dr. Moncrief spent Christmas evening alone in his study, a fire crackling in the hearth, a glass of whiskey warming in his hands. He thought about the passage of time, about how 3 months before, in September, Edinburgh had been a different city, prosperous, confident, looking forward to the future. Now it was a city under siege, paralysed by fear, looking over its shoulder at every shadow. And he thought about the killer wherever they were. Were they celebrating Christmas? Did they have family, friends, normal human connections? Or were they utterly isolated, locked inside their own mind, driven by compulsions no one else could understand? The snow continued to fall outside his window, accumulating on the sills, muffling the sounds of the city. Edinburgh was beautiful and terrible, ancient and enduring, a place where history lived in every stone, and where the present was always haunted by the past. Dr. Moncrief had been born here, had lived his entire life within sight of the Castle Rock, had walked these streets so many times he knew them in his bones. He loved this city with a fierce loyalty that transcended reason, and he hated what was being done to it, how fear was poisoning it, how the murders were changing it into something smaller and meaner. He made himself a promise as he sat by the fire on Christmas night. He would not give up. He would continue searching for answers, continue trying to understand the pattern, continue hoping that somehow, some way, the truth would emerge and the killer would be caught. It was a small promise, perhaps futile, but it was all he could offer. His skill, his knowledge, his stubborn refusal to accept that evil could triumph absolutely. The fire burned low, the whiskey glass emptied. Dr. Moncrief eventually rose and went to bed, though sleep came slowly, interrupted by dreams of symbols carved into stone and eyes staring upward at stars they could no longer see. The city slept around him, uneasily, fearfully, waiting for morning and for whatever that morning might bring. The watch walked their routes through the snow-covered winds. The constables stamped their feet and blew on their hands and peered into the darkness. And somewhere in that darkness, perhaps, the killer waited too, invisible as always, patient as stone, preparing for what would come next. December passed day by cold day. The snow melted and fell again. The new year approached, 1821 waiting just beyond the horizon, and with it the hope that perhaps the new year would bring an end to the terror, that the killer would be caught or would simply stop, that Edinburgh could return to itself. But hope was a fragile thing, easily broken, and in a city built on rock and history and the accumulated weight of centuries, nothing ended easily. The past clung to the present like frost to stone, and what had been set in motion months before in Advocates' Close had not yet run its course. The pattern was not complete, the symbols had more to say, and Edinburgh, ready or not, would have to endure whatever came next. Chapter 9. The Final Mark. The last days of December brought a brief thaw. The temperature rose above freezing for the first time in weeks, and the accumulated snow turned to slush that ran in dirty streams through the wynds and courts. The ice that had made the cobblestones treacherous melted away, revealing the ancient stone beneath, worn smooth by centuries of feet. Fog rose from the warming ground, thick and grey, rolling through the old town like something alive, reducing visibility to a few yards, turning familiar streets into landscapes of uncertainty. It was in this fog, on the evening of December 29th, that the midnight terror struck for the fifth and final time. The body was found in the Grass Market, that broad open space at the western foot of the Castle Rock where markets had been held for centuries, and where, more grimly, Edinburgh's gallows had once stood. The condemned had been hanged there in front of crowds that numbered in the thousands, their bodies left to swing as warnings and entertainment. The gallows were long gone now, but the Grass Market retained its association with death, and the older residents still avoided lingering there after dark. She was discovered at dawn by a coachman preparing his horses for the day's work. She lay against the wall of the White Hart Inn, a coaching tavern that had served travellers for generations. Her position was the same as all the others, on her back, arms crossed, clothing arranged, eyes open to the grey morning sky. And carved into the wall behind her, cut deep into the ancient stone, the symbol, 3 lines crossing, the 5th iteration of a message no one had yet deciphered. Her name was Margaret Wilson. She was 26 years old, a widow whose husband had died in a mill accident 2 years before. She worked as a seamstress, the same occupation as Margaret Dowie, the first victim. She had been walking home from a late commission, carrying her work basket, following a route she had taken dozens of times before. She had been careful, always was careful, travelled with others when possible. But on this particular evening in the thick fog, she had found herself alone as she crossed the Grass Market toward her lodgings on the West Port. The fog had been so dense that a person could disappear 3 steps away. Sound was muffled. Direction became uncertain. Even familiar landmarks were invisible. It would have been easy for someone to approach unseen, to close hands around a throat before a scream could form, to kill efficiently and quietly while the fog concealed everything. Dr. Moncrief arrived within an hour of the discovery. He moved through the scene with the mechanical precision of someone who had done this too many times, noting the same details he had noted 4 times before. The bruising at the throat, the lack of defensive wounds, the careful arrangement of the body, the symbol carved into stone. But as he knelt beside Margaret Wilson's body, something broke inside him. Perhaps it was exhaustion, or accumulated grief, or simply the recognition that he had failed. 5 women dead, 5 families destroyed, 5 lives ended by violence while he and all the resources of Edinburgh's learned institutions had watched helplessly, unable to prevent any of it. He stood and walked away from the body, out into the centre of the Grass Market, and looked up at the castle looming above through gaps in the fog, Edinburgh's ancient heart, Scotland's fortress and symbol, and at its feet, this. Murder repeated until it became routine, horror that had lost its power to shock simply through repetition. The magistrates convened immediately, but there was nothing new to discuss. The killer had struck again, precisely as expected, following the same pattern with the same result. The doubled watch had been useless. The increased reward had brought no information. All their efforts had accomplished nothing. Lord Provost Trotter looked older than he had months before, his face lined with worry and lack of sleep. He asked the assembled officials if anyone had anything new to contribute, any insight that might lead to the killer's capture. The room was silent. Finally, Dr. Moncrief spoke. He had been studying the pattern of the murders for months now, he said, and he had come to a conclusion. The killer was not operating randomly or impulsively. The murders were planned, deliberate, part of some larger purpose that only the killer understood. The symbols were not meaningless scratches but deliberate communications, each one building on the previous, creating something. And now there were five murders. 5 symbols, 5 points on a map of Edinburgh. He unrolled his chart and showed them. Advocates Close, the Cowgate, Flesh Market Close, Horse Wynd, the Grass Market. 5 locations scattered through the old town, connected by the same method, the same symbols, the same careful ritual, and if one drew lines connecting them, if one looked at them as points in a geometric pattern. Dr. Moncrief had done this, had spent hours with compass and ruler trying to find meaning in the geography. The points did not form a perfect shape, but they suggested something. A rough pentagon, perhaps, or the outline of a star, or some other configuration that might have meaning to someone versed in sacred geometry or occult symbolism. But even as he presented this, he knew it was speculation. He was seeing patterns because the human mind demanded patterns, imposed order on chaos even when none existed. The killer might have chosen those locations for purely practical reasons. Isolation, darkness, opportunity, with no geometric significance at all. The magistrates thanked him for his continued efforts, but had no actionable intelligence to extract from his theories. They were no closer to catching the killer than they had been in August. The meeting adjourned with instructions to maintain vigilance and to continue the investigation. But everyone present understood that these were empty words. They were simply going through the motions, maintaining the appearance of authority while admitting privately that they were defeated. The newspapers published the news that afternoon with a tone of weary resignation. 5th victim of midnight terror discovered. The articles recounted the familiar details, the strangulation, the positioning, the symbol. They interviewed citizens who expressed fear and anger. They quoted ministers who offered prayers and platitudes. They called for action but could not specify what action should be taken. Edinburgh had become accustomed to horror. The 5th murder shocked people less than the first had, not because they cared less, but because their capacity for shock had been exhausted. Fear had become the new normal. Living under threat had become routine. Margaret Wilson was buried in Greyfriars Kirkyard on the last day of December, as the old year died and the new year prepared to arrive. The funeral was sparsely attended. She had few friends, no family in Edinburgh, only a handful of other seamstresses who had worked alongside her in various shops. They stood in the cold wind and watched as the coffin was lowered into frozen ground, and they wondered which of them might be next. Because that was the terrible truth that hung over every woman in Edinburgh. The killer showed no signs of stopping. 5 victims in 5 months. The pattern might continue indefinitely. Any woman who walked the streets after dark was potentially the next target. Some families made the decision to leave Edinburgh entirely. Those who had the means departed for other cities or for the countryside, abandoning their homes and businesses rather than live under the constant threat. Those who could not afford to leave simply endured, adapting their lives as best they could, creating networks of protection, changing their routines, hoping that caution might be enough. Dr. Moncrief spent the last night of 1820 alone in his study, as he had spent Christmas. He had been invited to several gatherings. Edinburgh's professional classes traditionally celebrated Hogmanay with parties and toasts, but he had declined them all. He had no desire for celebration, for the forced gaiety of people trying to pretend everything was normal. He sat by his fire and reviewed his notes one more time. 5 murders, 5 symbols, 5 women whose lives had intersected with a killer's purpose and been snuffed out like candles. Margaret Dowie, Helen Murray, Annie Forsyth, Catherine Reed, Margaret Wilson. He had memorized their names, their faces, their histories. He felt he owed them that much, even if he had failed to protect them or avenge them. At midnight, the bells of St. Giles began to toll, marking the transition from 1820 to 1821. Throughout the city, people opened their doors despite the cold, following the old Scottish tradition of first footing, of welcoming the new year with symbolic gestures meant to bring good fortune. Dark-haired men carried coal and whiskey to their neighbours' homes. Families embraced and toasted with whatever spirits they could afford, but the celebrations were muted, haunted by the knowledge that the old year was ending with the same terror that had marked its final months. There was no reason to believe the new year would be any different. Dr. Moncrieff stood at his window and looked out over the darkened city. The gas lamps of the new town glowed in orderly rows. Beyond them, the old town was darker, more mysterious, its wynds and closes invisible in the night. Somewhere in that darkness, perhaps, the killer stood at a window too, listening to the bells, contemplating their work. 5 murders. Was that enough? Was the pattern complete? Or would there be a 6th, a 7th, continuing until something stopped them? Capture, death, or simply the satisfaction of having accomplished whatever purpose drove them? Dr. Moncrieff had no answers. He turned from the window and sat down at his desk, opening his notebook to a fresh page. He drew the symbol once more, the 3 lines crossing, stark and geometric in the lamplight. And as he stared at it, he felt a strange certainty wash over him. This was the last one. 5 was the number. The pattern was complete. He had no rational basis for this feeling. It was intuition, or perhaps simply hope dressed up as knowledge. But the certainty remained, settling into his bones like cold. The midnight terror had run its course. The killer would not strike again. The question was whether they would ever be caught, whether justice would ever be served, or whether they would simply fade back into the anonymity of Edinburgh's crowded streets, becoming another of the city's unsolved mysteries, another ghost story told in taverns and tenements for generations to come. Dr. Moncrieff closed his notebook and extinguished his lamp. Outside, the bells fell silent. The new year had arrived, carrying with it all the uncertainty that any year brings, but also the fragile hope that perhaps the worst had passed. Edinburgh slept uneasily, as it had for months. The watch continued their patrols, the constables checked their doors, and in 5 different locations scattered through the old town, symbols carved in stone and wood remained, silent testimonies to events no one had been able to prevent or explain. The darkness held its secrets close, as it always had, and the city endured, as it always would, built on rock too solid to be shaken even by horror, too ancient to be changed fundamentally even by death. Chapter 10. The Silence That Remains. January passed without another murder. The city waited, tense and vigilant, expecting each dawn to bring news of a 6th victim. But the dawn brought only cold and frost and the ordinary struggles of winter. The watch maintained their patrols. The magistrates held their meetings. The newspapers ran occasional articles about the unsolved murders, speculating on the killer's identity and whereabouts. But no new bodies appeared. No new symbols were carved. The midnight terror, it seemed, had simply stopped. February came with slightly longer days and the first hints that winter would eventually end. Still no murders. The doubled watch was gradually reduced as resources strained and the immediate crisis appeared to have passed. Citizens began, cautiously, to resume something like their normal lives. Women still travelled in groups when possible, still avoided the darkest winds, but the paralysing fear that had gripped the city for months began to ease. March brought the first crocuses pushing through the frozen ground in Prince's Street gardens. The ice in the Firth of Forth broke up and drifted out to sea. The days grew noticeably longer, and still no murders occurred. Dr. Moncrieff's intuition, it appeared, had been correct. 5 was the number. The pattern was complete. Whatever the killer had been trying to accomplish, they had apparently accomplished it. But the absence of new murders brought no closure, no satisfaction, only a different kind of uncertainty. If the killing had stopped, why? Had the killer left Edinburgh? Had they died of natural causes? Had they simply satisfied whatever compulsion drove them and returned to a normal life, indistinguishable from any other citizen. The investigation continued, but with diminishing energy and resources. The Lord Provost, relieved that the immediate crisis had ended, was eager to move on to other matters. Edinburgh had suffered economic damage from the months of fear. Businesses had lost revenue, property values had declined, the city's reputation had been tarnished. The focus now needed to be on recovery, on rebuilding confidence, on attracting back the commerce and visitors who had avoided the city during the terror. The unsolved murders became an embarrassment, a failure that no one wanted to dwell on. The files were maintained, the case remained technically open, but no one seriously expected it to be solved. The killer had won, in a sense. They had committed 5 perfect murders and vanished without consequence. Dr. Moncrief could not accept this. He continued his research through the spring and into the summer, even as his colleagues at the university gently suggested he might be obsessing unhealthily, that he should perhaps focus on other matters, that life must go on even when justice fails. But he could not let it go. The 5 women haunted him. Their unsolved deaths felt like personal failures, accusations he could not answer. He had devoted his life to understanding the human body, to the scientific study of life and death, and he had been helpless when it mattered most. He spent hours in the locations where the murders had occurred, revisiting Advocates Close, the Cowgate, Flesh Market Close, Horse Wynd, the Grass Market. He measured distances, noted architectural features, tried to understand what the killer had seen in these places. The symbols remained, though weather and time were beginning to erode them. The carved marks on stone and wood would last for years, perhaps decades, silent witnesses to events no one understood. Dr. Moncrief photographed them, photography being a new technology that was just becoming available, creating permanent records before they faded entirely. He compiled everything he had learned into a comprehensive report that ran to nearly 200 pages. He documented every detail of every murder, every theory that had been proposed, every avenue of investigation that had been pursued. And at the end of it all, he had to write the conclusion that no one wanted to read. The identity of the killer remained unknown. The motive remained unclear. The meaning of the symbols remained undeciphered. The case was unsolved and likely would remain unsolved. He submitted his report to the magistrates in August of 1821, exactly 1 year after Margaret Dowie's death. It was filed away in the city's archives, where it would sit for decades, consulted occasionally by historians and true crime enthusiasts, but offering no answers to the questions it raised. Life in Edinburgh gradually returned to normal. The terror faded from immediate memory into history. The women who had died became names in newspapers, cases in files, statistics in the city's mortality records. But they were not entirely forgotten. In certain families, their memory was kept alive. Margaret Dowie's sister Catherine never stopped wondering what had happened in Advocates Close that August night. Annie Forsyth's father closed his bakery and moved away from Edinburgh, unable to continue living in the city where his daughter had been killed. And in the tenements and taverns, the story was told and retold, evolving with each telling into legend. The Midnight Terror became a cautionary tale, a ghost story, a piece of Edinburgh's dark folklore. Parents told their children about it to teach them caution. Tour guides would eventually point out the locations to visitors. The murders became part of the city's identity, one more chapter in its long and often violent history. Dr. Moncrief lived another 30 years. He continued his medical practice, taught at the university, published papers on anatomy and forensic science. He never married, never spoke publicly about the murders after submitting his report, but those who knew him well understood that he had been changed by the experience, that something in him had broken that winter of 1820 and never fully healed. In his private journals, which would not be discovered until after his death, he returned again and again to the unsolved case. He sketched the symbols repeatedly, as if by drawing them enough times he might finally understand them. He wrote theoretical profiles of the killer, imagining their psychology, their motivations, their life after the murders ceased, and he wondered, always wondered, whether the killer had ever felt remorse, whether they understood the suffering they had caused, whether they ever walked past the locations of their crimes and remembered what they had done there. The symbols remained visible well into the 1840s, when urban renewal began to transform parts of Edinburgh's old town. Some of the buildings where murders had occurred were demolished. Others were renovated, the marked stones removed or covered over. By the 1850s, most of the physical evidence of the murders had disappeared, erased by time and progress, but the memory persisted. Historians researched the case, publishing articles and books that analysed the evidence and proposed various theories. The killer had been a doctor. The killer had been a sailor. The killer had been a woman. The killer had been motivated by madness or revenge or occult beliefs or sexual pathology. Every generation reinterpreted the murders through the lens of their own understanding, their own anxieties, their own conceptions of evil. The truth, if there was a single truth, remained elusive. Somewhere in Edinburgh's history, a person had killed 5 women for reasons known only to themselves, had marked their kills with symbols that might have meant everything or nothing, and had then vanished back into the anonymity of ordinary life. They might have lived out their years quietly, dying of old age in their own bed, carrying their secrets to the grave. They might have confessed on their deathbed to a minister who kept the confession secret. They might have been caught for some other crime and hanged without anyone realizing they were also the Midnight Terror. Or they might have killed themselves, unable to live with what they had done, their body buried in an unmarked grave with no one knowing who they really were. Every outcome was possible, none could be proven. The case remained open in the official records, technically unsolved, though no one expected new evidence to emerge after so many years. Dr. Moncrieff died in 1851 at the age of 78. He was buried in Greyfriars Kirkyard, not far from some of the women whose deaths he had spent so much of his life trying to understand. His gravestone made no mention of the Midnight Terror case, listing only his contributions to medical science and education. But in his will, he left instructions that all his papers related to the murders be donated to the university library, to be made available to future researchers. Perhaps he hoped some future generation with better tools and better understanding might solve the mystery that had eluded him. Those papers still exist today, carefully preserved, occasionally consulted. The photographs he took of the symbols, the maps he drew, the interviews he conducted, the theories he proposed, all of it remains. A window into that dark winter when Edinburgh lived in fear and 5 women died for reasons no one could determine. The wynds where the murders occurred are still there mostly. Advocates' Close descends from the High Street much as it did in 1820, though the buildings have changed and gas lamps have given way to electric lights. The Grassmarket is still a broad open space, though it's now filled with restaurants and bars rather than markets. Edinburgh has grown and modernised, but its ancient heart remains, layer upon layer of history compressed into stone and soil, and sometimes, on foggy nights when the mist rolls in from the firth and the old winds fall silent, it's possible to imagine what it was like in 1820. To imagine the darkness and the fear, the footsteps echoing off stone, the hands that closed around throats, the careful arrangement of bodies like offerings to gods no one believed in anymore. The Midnight Terror is gone, has been gone for 200 years. But the questions remain. The symbols remain, at least in photographs and sketches. The mystery remains, unsolved and perhaps unsolvable, one of Scotland's greatest criminal enigmas. Who killed Margaret Dowie, Helen Murray, Annie Forsyth, Catherine Reed, and Margaret Wilson? Why did they kill them? What did the symbols mean? And why did they stop? No one knows. No one has ever known. And after 2 centuries, no one likely ever will. The past keeps its secrets. History buries its dead. And Edinburgh endures, built on rock and bones and the accumulated weight of all the stories it contains, the noble and the shameful, the known and the unknown, the solved and the forever mysterious. In the end, perhaps that's the only truth we can state with certainty. That evil walked these streets in 1820, that it killed without mercy and vanished without consequence, that 5 women died and justice was never served, and that somewhere in the dark corners of history, in the gaps between what we know and what we can prove, the truth remains, silent, hidden, waiting for someone to finally read the symbols correctly, to understand the pattern, to solve the mystery that defeated everyone who tried. But until that day comes, if it ever does, the Midnight Terror remains what it has always been, a shadow in Edinburgh's long memory, a whisper in the winds, a story told on dark nights when the fog rolls in and the city remembers its ghosts. The candles have burned low, the night grows quiet, and history, once again, turns the page in the dark. The end.